So we had a lot of new people here. So I'm Christopher. Josh is back there. We organized the KnoxvilleJS meetup. Last one was in October, so I used the excuse of the holidays and then not having a place to have it to just kind of take some time off. So now we're back though. So thanks Saltworks Brewery for letting us have us here. So Glenwood Fruit Wise, he brought the food and pizza as always. We have a couple licenses from JetBrains to give out after the talk tonight. So if you want to get in on that, there's the sign-in sheet right here. I'll just use a random number generator like I always do. So and then we've still got some crap from Big Nerd Ranch. So they're a sponsor still. Please take the stuff. I'm tired of it. So I have to take it home every day. So there's some koozies and some stickers and stuff and some glasses. Let's get them out of here. That's about all I have. So we got Chris Keathley from Carbonfive in Chattanooga. We got some more Carbonfive people back there in the back. He's going to give a talk tonight. Hey.
That swag thing's a real deal, by the way. Like I run a meetup group in Chattanooga, and we got DigitalOcean to sponsor us, and they sent us like the biggest box of T-shirts ever. And like the mediums and larges and smalls, like normal, like extra larges, like those go pretty quick, and then you're left with a box of like 30 random size shirts.
We didn't even get shirts. We got can koozies.
Oh, ooh.
And fake glasses.
Oh, okay. So you need a koozie at least. So take that. I had a box of DigitalOcean shirts in my house for like a year, which was awesome. So anyway, yeah. So I'm Chris Keathley. I go by Chris Keathley on the internet and on Twitter and stuff. And so if you want to talk to me after this, feel free to tweet at me or ask me questions or whatever. Hassle me. That works too. And I'm going to be talking about designing components with React and CSS modules. So just like before we get started, who's already doing React? So a handful of people. Cool. Anybody play with CSS modules yet? Okay, probably the same handful of people. What about other frameworks? Like what else is everybody playing with or using in production right now?
Angular.
Angular what?
Angular 1.
1x. 1 something.
jQuery.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, jQuery is definitely a thing still. What about Ember? Am I doing Ember or anything like that? Okay. What about CycleJS? What about Batman? Batarang or Cyclone. That's not a framework, but now it is because I said it. And I'm sure someone's writing it currently. I want to talk a little bit about fatigue. This is a real thing, right? We hear this a lot. This is like a meme, like JavaScript fatigue. Why is that a thing? Well, it's because you hear new ideas and new things, and you told sort of like, I should learn this. There's probably some good ideas here. And I think that we as developers, we know the benefits of everything and the trade-offs of nothing. Frameworks and tools and tool choices are all about trade-offs, right? That's why we pick certain things. And I'm going to show you a lot of new tools, and maybe some people came to hear just about new tools. And that's cool, that's great. We should always be learning that kind of stuff. But more importantly, I want to emphasize a technique here because this is I pick these tools for me personally because they help me achieve my end goal. They help me achieve the thing that I want to do, which is do design with components. And so if that's not your end goal, you don't have to use this stuff. And that's okay. So I don't want to spread more fatigue because that would be awful. But it's great. There's all these great tools out there in the world, and we should take advantage of the ones that make sense to us, not the ones that maybe are new and shiny and awesome, despite the fact that some of these are new and shiny. All right. So what are we actually going to talk about if we're not going to talk about fatigue? We're talking about why components. Why do we care about components at all? So we're talking about React, CSS modules, Webpack, Postcss, and that's it, and Postcss. So why components? So I've been doing front-end design for the past several years. There's some people in the room, in the audience here, who a couple years ago we were building big Angular apps and stuff like that. I went on to build more big Angular apps, and I was getting really frustrated with Angular. And that's not to say that Angular is a bad tool. There's plenty of people who like Angular, and that's fine. And you can build great websites with it. But I was becoming really, really frustrated just with a lot of things, right? So if you think about like the first problem, which is that the separation of concerns is wrong, right? This is the thing that I was really feeling when I was doing a lot of Angular stuff. And I say the separation of concerns is wrong. Does everybody know what I mean when I say separation of concerns? Okay, okay, cool. And I kept running into these problems. Like if you think about just trying to do TDD, right? What do you got to do to test a controller in a controller action? We have to new something up. You have to get the controller. You have to get a template probably if you want to actually test it with DOM. So you've got to inject the template, and then you've got to run the digest loop, and then you've got to like fire events. And this was all really like a big pain to me. And again, I'm like, I don't want to pick on Angular, and this is true for a lot of things. Like if you're doing jQuery, just raw jQuery, you would need to bind event handlers to some template and then test that everything worked out at the end. And you'd be setting up a ton of world. And in fact, you do set up a ton of world. So much to the point where it's actually easier typically just to do feature tests and run like a headless browser. And I felt like this was just wrong. Like it was just actually just wrong. Like I'm setting up all this world over and over again. In any other code paradigm, in any other language, any other kind of world, I would realize that this was a smell. I'd recognize it as a smell, and I'd probably fix it. I'd encapsulate it in some other way. And I remember having a conversation with my friend, much like in a situation like this, and there may have been beer involved. And I was like, man, what if the DOM was just AST? Like, what if the DOM was just Lisp, and we could just eval like 60 ticks a second? How awesome would that be? Because we could you put state somewhere up at the top and let that flow down, and then you just eval over and over again. And you get like all this interactivity for free. And I went on this big tirade about this, and I woke up the next morning and he sent me this text. He's like, dude, have you seen React? And I discovered React, and I never looked back. Because it did exactly that for me. It allowed me to sort of create that world that I wanted. And yes, before anybody asks, I have seen Ohm and Ohm Next, and those are awesome too. So you can actually have Lisp in Azure DOM. So if you haven't seen Ohm and Ohm Next, it's closure script for React. The thing is your app is already built out of components. So think about the app that you work in right now. Right? This is an app that I work on. It's called Stickies.io. What it allows you to do is create different sticky notes on kind of a virtual whiteboard. And you can drag them around, you can edit them and create them. And it's all in real time. You can see who's editing what, you can change the colors of notes. This is an app that my company produces. If you look at this, you can instantly see some components here, right? You can instantly start to see that there's very common motifs. There's very common things that are shared throughout this application. They're not only shared in layout, but they're definitely sort of shared in this presentational way. So the thing I want to focus on, the thing that jumps out to me immediately, are those avatars. Those are really easy to kind of a good example to think about what a component would look like. So we create a directory, we create our avatar component. We can use React for that, and it'll look something like this. And sorry, I'm just gonna sorry, not sorry. I do everything in ES6. You should as well. I'm not gonna really apologize for that. You embrace it. It's awesome. And also, if you're not familiar with that specific syntax, that's a stateless function component in React. It's just a simple function, and I can return that, and I can use that to render JSX. Also, if any of this stuff you have questions about, just shout at me. Let's have a dialogue about this. And so anyway, so all I do is I import React, and then I just export this constant function avatar, and all it does is return an image with a certain class name, the source that I pass in, and the name of that person. And I've encapsulated what it means to have an avatar. If later on I wanted to add a link around that thing that took you to Gravatar, or maybe I wanted to pre-calculate their Gravatar, I could do that in this component, and that would make sense. But I need to use that somewhere, so I also need to wrap it with something. So I'm going to create another component called card authors. And this one's a little bit more involved and also apparently getting slightly cut off at the bottom. Sorry about that. But you can see that we get this card authors component. And then this is, I'm using a different kind of style of React component. And this is what we call a stateful component. where we actually use the React.create class. And what we're doing here, you can start down here at the bottom. Also, oh my god. Sorry, if anybody doesn't like the preceding comma on the new line style, sorry, not sorry. Sometimes I actually had someone get mad at me in a conference about that, literally mad at me. It's like, man, you've got to have something better to do in your life. But anyway, what I'm doing here is down here in the render function, which is the bottom function here. I'm taking a list of avatars that's just in this state. You could get this from an AJAX request, or this could come in from your fancy GraphQL endpoint, or you could get it from some sort of Redux thing. It doesn't really matter. For all just simplicity, I'm putting it inside the state of this component. And what I'm doing is I'm mapping over it. Map just takes a list, applies a function to it. That function in turn returns a avatar component, and then I render that list of avatar components out. And that allows me to render multiple avatars. Pretty straightforward. Have I lost everybody at this point? No? Okay, cool. I'm gonna take silence to mean you're doing awesome. So if I'm not doing awesome, you should tell me.
Trying to get beyond the commas.
Yeah, that comma. Man, that comma trips so many people up. But it's really good, because then your diffs don't get mangled. But your diffs don't get mangled at that point, and yeah, you can just delete stuff, and it's awesome. You don't have to remember that trailing comma. What happens if you ship that to production? It doesn't work. There you go. What? Shut up. This is my talk. Let me put my commas where I want. So the second problem with this, though, so that's a way to encapsulate logic. It's a way to encapsulate view logic. But it's not a way to encapsulate styles yet.
Yes, I just wanted to make a point. Angular's learned from this.
Yes,
and
that's
so
absolutely.
they are moving a lot towards the component model as well. So.
Yeah, no. So yeah, I really don't mean to malign Angular at all. It's an easy target, unfortunately. And
we got this kid.
Yeah. I did Angular forever. No, yeah, Angular 2 is going to be all component based with TypeScript, and
even Angular 1's got
component
integrators.
Nice.
Things like that. So.
Right. And Ember 2 is going kind of full component stuff as well, and all that stuff's really good, and you should use it if it makes sense in your app or whatever. So the second problem, though, is that styles are hard. Right? Styles are still hard to maintain, and there's a lot of problems. that there's a lot of things that lead to that. The first is the box model. The box model is actually just hard, right? And for those of us who've been doing this a while, we may understand the box model, but the fact is the box model is hard to lay out presentations with. And it has been traditionally using sorts of widths and margins and trying to make stuff float correctly and everything else. Global scope. Everything in CSS is globally scoped. We typically know that that's a bad thing. We come from more from less of a design background and maybe more of a programming background. Global scope, pretty much considered not necessarily a good thing. Encapsulation is hard. And that's just a problem across every paradigm. Styles are coupled to your HTML structure, unfortunately, despite our best efforts. And also browsers. Thank you, IE, for ever. And now Safari, which, by the way, when did Safari become the new IE? Except mobile Safari randomly? I don't get it. Browsers are hard. The good news is that CSS has gotten a lot better, a lot better. And when people complain about CSS, they often don't know how good CSS is actually getting. And the biggest thing, what's everybody's favorite new thing in CSS? That's right now. Flexbox. That's right. Flexbox. Who is using Flexbox right now? Who knows about Flexbox and isn't getting to use it? Okay, cool. So some people. Who doesn't know about Flexbox? No shame. It's all good. What is Flexbox? I am so glad you asked that. Flexbox is a way to, in your CSS, to be able to define the way things actually flex inside of a container. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm wrapping this in an example wrapper, which unfortunately I didn't get a chance to put a border around so you can see it. But there's a div around both of those A and B divs. and that's marked as display flux. So what I have to do is just say display flux. And this, and Flexbox also for reference is being used in, it's gaining ground every day in terms of the browsers that support it. And now especially with Microsoft really like putting the end to old IE. We'll be able to use this hopefully most places, although I did just run into a bunch of problems with Edge the other day. So whatever. Your mileage may vary. But what we can do here is in each of these are an example, and they flex grow by 1 and they shrink by 0. So in this case, because they're both 1, so you have, I think I have a laser pointer on this thing. Oh, I do. Now I feel like a professor. So I have A and B, both of these are examples. They're boxes inside of a container. They both are set to flex 1, which means that they both will take up the same amount of space. And I'm just arbitrarily setting the background color so you can see the difference. If instead I say that A is a flex 2 and B is a flex 1, A will take up more space than B. Twice as much. Twice as much, in fact. And obviously, if I add a third thing, which is getting slightly cropped, sorry about that, and I say that A takes up 2, B takes up 1, C grows 2, then you can see that everything works out inside of here. Any questions about that so far? No? Cool. So Flexbox. Flexbox is the way that we can start to really enable and empower our component designs, and we can really start to decouple our presentational designs from our layout. And we're going to see how to do that in just a minute. I think that's really important. So global scope. So this is a serious problem. It's inherent to CSS. We can't do a ton about it. And here's what I mean by that. So let's say I have a card component, a card thing. Everybody's all about cards these days. Thank you, Google. So I create a div with a card. Inside of it, it's got some text. Inside of that, it's got a footer. That has more text inside of it. And you can see I've got text, footer, and card styles defined. What's the problem with those? One, they're named in such a way that like they can get clobbered easily by other stuff. They don't really provide a whole lot of like semantic meaning necessarily. And also the problem is really just that they're global, which means that anything else that you mark as a footer will now get those styles. So how do we solve this? Well, traditionally, we do something like this. We just preface all the styles with card text, card footer, and card. And a lot of times you'll even see like card footer is inside of, if you're using Sass or less or something, it'll be, you'll make it even more specific. So you do card.cardFooter and card.cardText. And that way you kind of get some specificity, so you're not always like stepping all over other people's styles. We also solve this with methodologies, and there's a ton of these. What kind of methodologies? You might use like a style methodology, like right now. Yeah. OOCSS. OOCSS is great. We'll talk about that in a minute. Anybody, anything else? BIM. Okay, so there's a bunch. So when I was trying to like solve this, I went through a bunch of different things. And the first I started with was atomic design. Has anybody heard of this? Atomic design, Brett Frost's jam. The problem with this was that it's using a lot of words that are fairly nebulous, and so it's hard to. And the whole idea is to create componentized designs. The other problem is it's incredibly non-prescriptive. And so it's really hard to know, based on his terminology, how to actually segment any of these things. But I really liked the idea of this. I liked the idea of kind of small atomic units of presentation. The other is like SMAX. Does anybody use SMAX? That's the other common one we use a lot at work. No? It's good. Go check it out. It's cool. And it tries to solve the same problems with global scoping by kind of using IDs for certain things that have more semantic meaning and using classes for other things. It's interesting. But didn't quite do what I wanted it to do. OOCSS. OOCSS is the idea of being able to take certain selectors and group them together. So if you use Bootstrap, anybody use Bootstrap? We've all kind of probably played with Bootstrap once, right? That's kind of an OOCSS model, where you can kind of take these disparate selectors and you could lump them all into some div or whatever, and gain new attributes. And there's nothing keeping you, obviously, in that paradigm from doing that in HTML itself or inside of some Sass mixin if you want to do that. And I thought this was really good, but it still has this problem with global scope. Like you still can't get away from that with global scope. So luckily, oh, and no, sorry, and we also have Vim. And Vim is just basically a naming convention, which would look like this, right? So instead of saying button, there's different types of buttons. We could do button disabled, button error, button in progress, those sorts of things. And we could create a bunch of overrides for buttons. The final thing, and the thing that I think is the most compelling, is CSS modules. CSS modules gives you a way to actually enforce OOCSS methodologies right out of the gate. Like you can opt into it and you can actually enforce it, and you can help do away with global scoping. So how does it work? So in traditional CSS, we might do something like this using Vim and kind of some OOCSS pattern along with our component. So we'll create a button component. We can mark it as disabled or whatever. And we just re-render a button out with the classes on them. If you're not familiar, this class names helper, it just joins a bunch of class names together. So for instance, this will always have button, and it'll have button disabled if this is true. And inside of here, we can create our styles. And that works pretty well. However, with CSS modules, we can do this. We can create a file called button.css. We can create different classes on top of that. We don't have to name them anything. We don't have to do anything specific. We don't have to preface it with .button or whatever. We just say .normal, .disable, .error, .in-progress, and we know because we're in the button.css file that that's where those styles are scoped to. Then in our component, yes, we import styles from button.css. Magic. We imported a CSS file, y'all, into our JavaScripts. And then we create a class name from it more the same way. And this time I'm just using a ternary because I want to be like that, I guess. And it'll be disabled. If it's disabled, then it's normal otherwise. So what do those styles actually look like? Well, what you can do is you can take this .common inside of the button.css file, and then everywhere else you want to use it, you can simply say composes, right? So normal composes common button styles. Disabled also composes common button styles. And when I import that and want to use it, it will use both the disabled styles and the common styles. And those classes actually get hashed into a hash so that when they're actually in the browser, they don't collide with each other.
Does the composes thing do like an extend or like a mix-in?
No, it actually uses the class. So that when I actually say like I want to use styles.disabled, it actually uses both.
How do you avoid just runaway from the load?
In what sense?
Just making an extremely large CSS payload. I'm not saying that it would happen in every case, but I can see it kind of metastasizing.
Bloat in
Size, number of roles.
I mean,
potential redundancies, things that don't really.
I mean, we
still
have
have to deal with CSS being CSS. And it's not like this is.
Yeah, but you have to deal with that no matter what, right? Like you have to deal with that. Like so, you have to like you're arguing. Are you saying how do I deal with just a bunch more classes out there in the world?
I guess I'm saying that if you remove the friction in that process of creation, then you may be a little lazier in how you condense your.
I mean, my experience has been the opposite. My experience has been that when you do this, when you enforce this, and we'll kind of look at some more examples, but when you actually enforce this, it forces you to create motifs as opposed to redoing styles everywhere. So like if you do a mix-in in Sass, like you've now bloated your class. You have one class, but it's got like 20 mix-ins in it, and now that's just a massive class with every style, and normalized inside of it. So you end up with the same problem. Like you have that problem no matter what, right? You have to think about like how you want to create motifs. And my experience has been that doing this actually allows you to encapsulate that better. Because like you can see what I'm doing here is I'm no longer kind of creating like an ad hoc idea about certain types of buttons or classes. I'm actually creating domain knowledge, which we love domain knowledge, right?
So if you wanted to use something like the grid system from Bootstrap or whatever, is that an import into this, and doesn't that kind of copy those same Bootstrap styles out to each component?
I believe you could do that. I've honestly never done this with Bootstrap.
Well,
so
I'm just thinking of a particular thing you want to share, like the grid system.
Sure. Like if you want to just import one piece of it,
Yeah.
yeah, you could probably do that.
But doesn't it copy it then to each?
No, because it still uses the same class. The class is just defined out there in the world, and you just like when you want to use it on your element, it just says use this class, and this class now.
Okay, so you're including whatever, like Bootstrap or whatever, as a separate CSS in addition to everything that you do.
If you use like Webpack or something, you could actually bring in just the pieces that you want. And then we'll talk about how you actually manage to do this. So yeah, so that's a thing. And the actual element, when you use these classes, it actually uses each of the classes that you've composed with. It doesn't like reduplicate styles and such. So that way, you hopefully can get more reuse out of your styles. You can also compose from other files. So for instance, like in my normal, I want to compose primary from font.css and primary from background.css. I want to compose subtle from font.css and subtle from background.css. And typically we would do this in like a giant variables file in Sass, right? Like how many of us have some like 1,000-line variables file in Sass that is every variable, and Bootstrap and whatever's, right? And it's impossible. It's like gray 5 or gray 4, like lighter gray. Like those variables mean nothing. They actually mean nothing. And we often have them there because we're accommodating for this crap. We're accommodating for the differences in fonts. The differences, I want a slightly blacker black for my font, but I want a less black for my border. It's like, just define that stuff in the place where it goes. Define an actual domain knowledge about what it means to be a subtle border. And this kind of gives you the power to do that. And you can define all these things just as proper classes. And they might have one thing in them. That's fine. You can compose that, and that's okay. Right, so you can also do this with weights and those sorts of things. Like, so for instance, this is actually what my starter kit for doing all this, using all these tools, which I have a link to at the end. It defines all this up front. It's got primary and subtle and bold, normal, light, small, medium, large. And it works out great because it kind of preemptively defines a set of rules about this kind of stuff. So what we can do here is if we want to create our button components and we want to import those things, we can actually use something like this, right? We can create a list of buttons, and those, and we can say that whatever the state we pass in, we'll use that from our styles, which allows us to get these different styles on our buttons. So if you just pass a state in like error or disabled or whatever the case may be, we can do that. And that's important because we want to pass state down into our presentational components. There's no state that belongs in our component here. We don't actually want state because state's hard. State is like the most complicated thing in your application, and you want to avoid it at all costs, really. And the easiest thing, what's the easiest thing in the world to test? A function that takes data in and gives you a result back. You can write that test in one line of code. It's awesome, and that's what we want to get out of our components as well. The problem is we conflate this because we have this problem of layout. Right? We use these buttons everywhere, and they need to lay out correctly in the rest of our code. So what we can do is we can use just presentational styles in our stateless components like this, but we can, and we can share styles amongst other buttons. So if I want to create like a submit button, I don't actually have to create a new type of button here. I could just create, I could just share the styles, or I can compose primary and uppercase and all these things. I can co-locate stuff. So if I have an avatar, for instance, or buttons, I could, put my CSS files in with my components, and I do this regularly. So if I have an avatar component like that, I'll put the avatar CSS with it, because that's where it goes. It goes right there. I mean, it doesn't belong to anything else. It belongs with the avatar, right? And actually, this started to get too big, but I actually put my tests in here too. I put my tests right there in the directory, because, why not? If somebody can help me figure out how to get tests, I think we can use Babel plugin. So we can help me figure out how to get tests inside of my component file. That would be the best. So I like co-location. I don't like switching files for stuff. And then along with that, we can put layout styles inside of the things that actually contain state. So for instance, this is some button container. It contains state about what kind of buttons it needs to show. And we can use very basic layout styles. We don't give this thing any other kinds of styles. We just say it flexes in this way, or whatever the case may be. It lays out in this way. And so if we want to create a row of buttons, we just say, okay, well, it's flexed and it does this. But if we want to actually say, actually, those should be in rows instead, well, we just do it. We just say import flex and rows from our layout, and then use it. Just group those two things together, flex and rows, and now we get rows. And Flexbox allows us to do that. This allows us to put actual layout inside of our stateful components. A lot of people will tell you, and you'll read things that are like, oh, the layout, stateful components shouldn't have anything. This is kind of a Redux meme if you use Redux in the React world. And I just kind of disagree with that. I think that's a good place there to actually lay things out and kind of create to actually format all this data that you actually want to show. So how do we actually do any of this? How do we actually put any of this stuff together? The first is Webpack. Who's using Webpack right now? Okay, so probably like the same React people. So Webpack is great. Who's using like Grunt or Gulp, or do you just use npm scripts? That's like the hipster thing to do, right? Just npm scripts. Oh, whatever. I'll use a build tool. Webpack's great. Webpack gives us a ton of flexibility, and I will not lie to you. Webpack is hard. Like, people will tell you Webpack's easy, and they're lying. It's not. It's very complicated. It's a very complicated tool. I choose to use it because it affords me a ton of flexibility, and I just happen to have been using it for long enough to kind of understand its weird idiosyncrasies. One, it allows loading of multiple types of files. So you saw me load a CSS file, import a CSS file using ES6 imports inside of my JavaScript. That's why I can do that because of Webpack. It also gives me code splitting, if you're into that kind of thing. The hipster kids are into that kind of thing. But it allows me to do things like say, arbitrarily, these 5 files, anything referenced as this is vendor. Put that in a vendor.js. Everything else goes in app.js. And that's a really quick way to optimize your site. Because how often do you actually change your vendor? I guess maybe if you're really fatigued, it's every day or every week or whatever. But in general, you don't change your vendor stuff that often, which means you can cache it separately. It can stay in their user's browser longer. They don't have to download it, and your app code can update more frequently. So it gives you stuff like code splitting, and that's like the most basic thing of code splitting that Webpack will do. It gets gnarly, because it's built for Facebook. It gives you chunking and optimization, so you can if you have multiple things you're using, you can can optimize your chunks out, so it puts oh, this gets loaded this many times, so I'm going to put that over there, and it does all kinds of gnarly, weird stuff in the hood. You can also use npm modules because okay, this is the only soapbox I'll actually get on. Let's just use npm. It's just all just agree to use npm. Please. There's no reason. I mean, it's already a package manager. It's great. It holds stuff, including CSS. It's fantastic. And I think we probably should all just be using npm. I guess, I don't know. If you want to still use Bower, that's fine. I don't know how much longer it'll be supported. Maybe that's FUD. I don't know. Yeah, it's not FUD. That's a real thing. Okay. npm's good. You use something else, right? You use some other fancy. Okay.
But it uses
npm.
It uses
Bower.
Yeah. Use npm. You get about code reloading. So this is the thing that you'll see touted a lot. You can actually live as you change stuff. It'll update live in the browser. And using some other fanciness, you can actually have it keep state. It's not live reload. That's different. It's not live reload in the sense that live reload just reloads the page really fast, right? This actually takes new code and shoves it into the browser live, so you don't have to reload. So your state stays the same, and you can change things like styles on the fly without actually changing app state. It's pretty cool. Also, a giant pain in the ass to get working correctly. And it does all this using loaders and pipelines. So this is a very trimmed down Webpack config. And there's a lot more that goes into Webpack config. Again, I'm not gonna lie to you and tell you that Webpack's easy. It's not. It takes a while to learn what's going on. But the important bit here is the loader section. So what we're doing here is we're testing files using a regex that checks for .js or .jsx. If they are of those type of files, then we're going to run them through the Babel loader. What that'll do is actually just kick it out to Babel, and we can let Babel do all of our compilation for like ES 2015. Is that what we're calling it? Have we agreed? It's ES 2015, not ES6. Still get that wrong. Or using whatever kind of future things you want to use, plus all the Babel plugins, which I'm coining a new term right now called Sebastian's Law, which is that anything that can be a Babel plugin will be a Babel plugin. Those of you who use Babel will get that joke. And we don't want to actually like recompile all our node modules. That'd be silly. They're compiled already. So we do that, and that's how we actually output JSX. That's how we turn JSX into actual proper JavaScript that the browser can run. And then in the CSS loader, we just test to see if it's a CSS file. If it is, we tell it to go through the style loader. The bang there, the exclamation point there is to tell you to go on to the next loader. So we'll go from style. We'll take well, technically it reads right to left. So we'll go Postcss. We'll process it. I'm right. It reads left to right. We'll go style. I'm so used to Sass and pre-CS, whatever. Style, we'll go through CSS modules. In that case, we're just saying load it in the CSS loader, but use modules. And then we pass it to Postcss, and Postcss will do some stuff to it at the end. And that outputs our CSS file. So Postcss. So who's using Postcss or has played with Postcss? 2 people? Cool. Postcss is rad. Who's using Sass or less or any of these things? Okay, so like almost everybody. So those are what are known as pre-compilers. They take some other language and they output CSS with it. Postcss, you see, it's called PostCSS because it doesn't do it pre, it does it post. So it takes output CSS and generates an AST and then passes that through a series of plugins. And then that can transform that AST. So it's really powerful, and it can do 1,000 different things because people have written every plugin for it. I don't recommend you use all of them. I mean, you could. That'd be wild. See where that gets you. But I use a handful of them that I find useful, which I'm going to talk about here. So in your Webpack config, you'll do something like this. You'll say PostCSS. You'll pass it a function. And then you'll tell it to run it through a series of plugins. So auto prefixer. Who's using auto prefixer? Everyone go use auto prefixer. It's dope. So for instance, that's not valid for a lot of old browsers and for IE as of right now. Sorry. So what auto prefixer does is it takes that, it compares it against a known set of can I use things. You can actually specify hey, I want to use the last 2 browsers that had 90% adoption or more, the config lets you say stuff like that. It's really cool. Or you can just be specific and be like, I want to still support IE7 because I hate my life. And it'll output you something like that. That's actually what that generates at the end. And it does it all for you. And that means you don't have to worry about knowing all of that junk. And you don't have to actually spend your time on it, because that would be awful. And you don't have to use mixins or anything like that. It just does it for you and compares it against a known set of working.
Sass actually dropped auto prefixing. It basically says you need to use some prefixing rather than do it for Sass.
Exactly. Yeah.
What about Compass?
Huh? Using mixins and such?
Yeah, but doesn't Compass come kind of
I don't know what it uses. I haven't used Compass in a long time.
Yeah. That's probably
yeah, I mean the other one that was really popular was Thoughtbot's jam. Bourbon, not bourbon. Bourbon was the great. Bitters or neat. Yeah, everybody's there's the set of mixins. Yeah, and it would do the same kind of stuff for you. This is, you should just use auto. I think everybody just uses auto prefixer at this point. And if you're not, you should totally go look at it. It's typically a drop-in for every framework that you're using right now. There's like, it's so good, someone has already made it work. I guarantee there's like a, is it Nougat? Nougat? Is that the thing? There's a Nougat package. There's something. There's a visual, is it a, what's it called? It's not a project. I don't even remember what the Visual Studio. A solution. There's a solution out there for it somewhere. I also use this. I auto group media queries. So I can write my code like this in different files. I can say I have an avatar. It displays none normally, but when I get to a bigger screen size, I want to display flex. And same for buttons. You know, when buttons are at a small screen size, by default, I want them to take up a large area. And then when they get to a larger screen size, they take up a smaller area. And what auto group media queries will do is it'll actually take those things and it'll create that CSS for you. So it actually groups that stuff together under the same media queries, not using media queries all over the place. This is a little performance optimization. There's tons of these plugins. Those are basically kind of the only two that I use. And I use CSS Ring just to do minification and such. There's loads of these, and go check them out. There's whole grid systems built in Postcss. You can do Sass syntax in CSS using a Postcss plugin. I don't even know how that works. Yeah, there's all kinds of cool stuff. Yes?
Is auto prefixer actually Postcss? Or
What now?
is auto prefixer actually a Postcss?
Yes.
plugin?
Yeah, auto prefixer is a Postcss plugin. Yeah. And so if you use auto prefixer, you end up using Postcss anyway. You can go real deep into these plugins, and I did at one point, and you know, it's like Emacs, like you go deep and then come back and use just like one or two things.
And at some point, you might not have to use Sass or less. Or
Right. Yeah. Actually, yeah. That's the goal. I think. Actually, you might be able to use. I think you can use Sass syntax now with Postcss.
Right, but you use a Postcss plugin to read Sass.
But I think it it understands. There's all kinds of cool stuff that they're working on. So, and it's cool. And actually, all the plugins are written in JavaScript. So if you already speak JavaScript, which I would assume everyone here knows some amount of JavaScript, given that this is a JavaScript meetup group, you can write all your plugins. And I've actually written a plugin just for funsies to see how it went. And it's pretty straightforward. It's got really good docs and really good examples. So it's worth checking out. Also, if you want to use any CSS Next, are you anybody familiar with CSS Next? No? Okay, cool. CSS Next is basically everything that's coming up in CSS. So all the new features, variables, and other stuff, you can tell how up to date I am on that. You can use it. It's a plugin. And you just say, use CSS Next, and now you have access to all the new stuff that might be going into CSS.
It's kind of like Babel for CSS.
It is. It's like Babel for CSS. There's loads of these. So, in conclusion, that was a lot of talk about tools and very specifics. More importantly, if you don't take anything else away from this talk, think about what you want to achieve. Think about the way that you and your entity works together, right? If you work very closely with designers, that informs the kinds of tools that you could be using. If you don't, if you're handed wireframes, and you said build this, and here's the components up front, that's going to also inform the kinds of tools that you can use. Think really hard about how you want to do this. These are the things that I find useful because I find doing this kind of development work on the front end to be very, very fast. I can get a lot done with it. And I find it very easy to change things long term. But if that's not your end goal, maybe tweak it a little bit and maybe drop in, I really like Angular, I hate React, that JSX stuff is for the birds. That's fine. Use Angular, that's awesome. Use what's gonna actually help you get things done. Focus on composition. This is, I think, really important just overall in all of your programming endeavors. Focus on how you actually want to compose things. Think about which piece of this is doing the work, which piece of this is doing the arrangement. How can I compose those two things together? And with that, I have some links. That Webpack React skeleton, I've dropped that a bunch of places, but that's what I use to start new applications. It's just on my GitHub. I'm Keathley on GitHub. It's Webpack React Skeleton. And if you want these slides, they're at my website, keathley.io, component design. I'll put this on the meetup link. I don't expect you to memorize it. And that's me on the internet. And I think, do we have time still? Or yeah, we have time to hang out and chat still. So if you have questions, I'd love to talk about this more. Yes?
A lot of interesting stuff here. My first question is, how much, you said you put a lot of emphasis on how you can execute on it quickly. Into your own personal preferences.
Yeah.
How much thought do you give to maintainability inside your team, and how would you, if you were in maybe a stodgier group of people, how would you maybe compose differently to kind of be more ecumenical to different people?
I mean, so here's the thing. Like, if you're using Angular right now at work, like, you don't have to switch. Like, no one's forcing you. Well, Google will force you to switch at some point, but like, you don't. Other than that, like, you can keep using tools that people are familiar with, and you should. Like, you don't want to throw away hard-won knowledge in your organization. It so happens that I work with startups mostly. So a startup will come to us and say, we want this built, we need this like prototype done or whatever. And we sometimes get to choose what we want to do, in which case I'll opt to do React because I know it pretty well, and I'll opt to use these tools. Because I find these tools to be infinitely more maintainable than without these tools. Like, I've done tons of Sass and trying to use mixins, and it's almost impossible to enforce. Because you might understand all the best practices about, oh, well, you should always be using a mixin here. Oh, don't use a mixin here. Don't ever use extend, because extend is, is an optimization nightmare, or whatever. You have all these internal rules, but you can't enforce that across your team. I find this sort of stuff, which enforces it at almost a language level, to be really useful when you're actually trying to communicate and then do iterative design. Because if it turns out that something needs to compose something else, if it's like, oh, well, now I need to change the font stacks that we're using. I can change the font stacks we're using, and everything else can compose of those font stacks. So I would say,
It sounds like what you're saying is not a lot of time to do it. At least if you're working with a startup, if you're like you and maybe one other person, but if then that startup goes off and does great things and they cut you out of the loop, it's probably looking like full-on rebuild, unless there just happens to be. No, not at all. Okay.
No. I mean, I'd be a scumbag, right? Like, if that was like, that's like what I turned over at the end. Like, hey, here's like some crap. Like, hope you can run a company. Like, that would make me awful. And that's never my goal. Like, I don't necessarily buy into the whole software craftsmanship movement, but like, I like to take a little bit of pride in what I like to think that like the stuff I'm turning over is decent. So I would say it's more about I think enforcing things at a language level is really powerful to communicate across your team. And when you're trying to move quickly, being able to swap out parts and understand like, oh, hey, we really need to take all those avatars that we have and now make them over here on the side line up in a column. Like, I can do that because I've properly separated my different pieces of presentation. So I get more reuse out of things. Does that make sense?
So,
yeah. Somebody else, maybe.
Yeah, so when you're using CSS modules, at what point does the CSS actually get loaded? Because it looks like you're importing it into the JavaScript file, so it would have to be, is it going to be part of the JavaScript bundle, meaning that when that component loads, and the CSS gets pulled in and rendered, or what are the steps there?
So Webpack, so what I do is in dev, I have it actually emit style tags. So it creates a style tag and it shoves the style tag up into the head of the document. And that allows it to do things like hot reloading. So if like stuff changes, it just changes the style tag, and that changes the browser. So so that's what I do in dev. What I didn't show here, and I can't get back to the computer, I would show it right now. And for production builds, when everything gets minified and goes through like gzipping and stuff like that at the end, what we actually do preemptively is we extract all the CSS documents into a file. And then we put that file, or several files sometimes, up on a CDN somewhere. So it's different depending on if you're in dev or if you're in production or staging.
So in the end, you end up with a separate CSS main.css and a separate main.js.
Yeah, we pull all that junk out and we extract it. And we do it just because, like, I mean, CSS is like, there's a whole meme about like, oh, well, you could just use JavaScript to style everything. And I think that that's interesting for sure. But CSS is really good at like what it's already good at. It's GPU optimized and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, and it's also, until HTTP2 like actually takes over, you know, it's still faster to take a big document and stick it up on a CDN somewhere and hash it.
Is it smart enough to where if you have a huge CSS file, but you only imported one of those selectors, that it'll only include that in the bundle, or is it just going to take the entire CSS file?
It depends on how you configure Webpack, but you can get it to do that, depending on how they give you the bundle. Yes?
If you looked at, I think it's called base CSS.
No.
Like super optimized CSS, and it looks like it'd be, I don't know if it was designed by components in mind.
Huh.
It looks like it'd be really optimal for.
I have not. I'll check it out. It's cool. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, you want to explain briefly how HTTP2 will really help to kind of enable component-based, and how that becomes a big deal.
Yeah. So with HTTP2, we can actually we can load multiple things at once, essentially, over a single pipe. And so it allows us to, like, basically all of our quote-unquote best practices right now, like concatenating files and all that stuff, is actually going to be awful. When we get to HTTP2. So you have to kind of pick one that you want to support. And that'll allow us to ship like different files. That's really cool because it means that your component just could have a file out there. Or, you know, you could chunk a file out there with a couple components, or with an endpoint, and then pull in files as you go, which could be cool.
I don't necessarily think it would be as cut and dry as that. So like if you have like one big file, you get a lot more visa compression out of that.
Yeah, but if you can download files simultaneously, it depends. I mean, it's a trade-off, right?
HTTP2 is preemptive, so the server can actually decide what to send down the pipeline. So the browser says, so like right now, right, we load up an HTML file, and then the browser then goes, oh, I gotta load up all this JavaScript and CSS, which may result in cascading, you know, downloads of elements and things like that. With HTTP2, you make a request to like index HTML, and the server can say, oh, by the way, you're going to also need this CSS and this JavaScript, and so it just sends everything down the pipe all at once. And at that point, you don't even have to compress or minify or anything because it's a binary. It's not text-based, it's actually a binary protocol.
Yeah. So Khan Academy did some research. They were using, or they're already using it, and they did some research, had some findings on it. So
oh, cool. Yeah, you should post that. So I'd love to read that. I will be honest and say I am very rough on the actual like notes about HTTP2. I haven't started like really optimizing for it yet. Yeah.
So one thing that I think is ancillary to your talk, which struck me, is when you're building those components, you're putting like CSS or JavaScript in the same folder.
Mm-hmm.
This is, in some ways, this is counter to what we learned in like MVC frameworks, right?
Yeah.
Because we put everything in a script file, we put everything in styles, you know.
Yeah.
And I'm just sitting back here thinking, well, that's the convention, and we all say, well, that's so I don't, you know, if it's a Rails, for example, and it uses our spec, I know the tests are going to be in the spec files, right? Because there's a spec folder somewhere.
Yeah.
Right? But I've been sitting back here thinking, that's a completely wrong way to look at it. Because what do those have in common except for the fact that they're texts? Nothing. They have nothing in common. Whereas if you put everything in the same folder for a button, for example, that has something in common because they're all interacting with the same component.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Like you know, this was weird for me when I first like started like delving into it. But I completely agree with that, and that goes back to that separation of concerns thing. Like we're kind of like bottle fed at this point in the web world on MVC, on these three letters MVC, and I think we've tried to replicate that in the browser and client side stuff, and I have just not been happy with that at all. And I think we should. It makes so much more sense to sort of like take all those things that are really composed together, the styles, the logic, like put that in one place, and then you can talk about it, all in one area. Like you don't have to, search around for it or anything like that. Yeah, that's all. Yes, so I agree. Yeah, yeah, and if we can figure out how to get a Babel plugin to strip my tests out of my component files, I'm all in. I want to just be able to look at it all. I have a big monitor. I just want to see it all.
Spin it all in one monitor.
Yeah, whatever. No big deal. Any other questions? No? All right, cool. Well, thanks, y'all.